Good to go.
We're here in the conservation area of room 19. Room 19 is a misnomer because it's actually a number of rooms that have all been knocked together, including the old lecture theatre, which we probably won't be seeing today, but maybe that's something to look forward to for a future Inside St Bride. We are not a newspaper library, despite our proximity to Fleet Street, but of course we can't ignore the fact that the newspaper industry is on our doorstep, or at least it was for a great many years. And so we have a sort of snapshot collection, firsts and lasts, when the Times newspaper changed from its old typeface to Times New Roman. We have copies of the last edition and the first edition. When the Guardian became a Berliner style tabloid, and when the Times newspaper became a tabloid, indeed when the News of the World published its final edition, we made sure that we got hold of copies of all of those. There is a teaching collection which we use with students who come in, and we show them examples of very early newspapers, a facsimile of the Daily Courant from 1702 and so on. But what I have on the desk in front of me is a few personal favourites. This, Berthold's Political Handkerchief, is actually an attempt to dodge tax. It is not a newspaper, despite the fact it might look like a newspaper. This is technically, or at least in the eyes of Henry Berthold, it's a handkerchief. Published in 1831, that year the tax on printed cotton was repealed. There were no taxes on plain white calico, but as soon as you applied any sort of design, there was a tax, I think, of about 5 or 6%. The government repealed that tax, which I think probably inspired Berthold to produce his handkerchief. No taxes on decorated cotton. There were a number of taxes on newspapers, and he produced this as a handkerchief. I mean, it's boldly stated in the title, Berthold's Political Handkerchief. This didn't help him to dodge tax. Unfortunately, the government, after 10 issues, warned him that any further copies would result in him going to prison, probably for quite a long stretch. And anyone who handled this newspaper stroke handkerchief would also be imprisoned. He was given the option of paying the tax. He chose not to do that, and so after 10 editions of Berthold's Political Handkerchief, it ceased publication. And that should pretty much have been the end of Henry Berthold, except something rather curious happened a year or so later. He went into a ladies' outfitter's on the Strand and asked to see a fur coat which was on display in the window. The shop assistant went to retrieve it, and during his absence, Henry Berthold wrapped a feather boa scarf around his fist and put it inside of his top hat, which he then placed on his head. Another shop assistant saw him stealing the scarf, went out onto the Strand, summoned a policeman. It hadn't been very long since the Metropolitan Police were actually founded. A policeman was brought in. Berthold had spotted this assistant leaving, quickly threw the scarf underneath the counter, and when the constable returned and the shop assistant said, that's the man, he stole it, it's inside of his hat, of course there was no evidence. To cut a long story short, Henry Berthold was tried at the Old Bailey for simple larceny, and he was sent to Australia, to the penal colony at Macquarie Bay, where he died after 3 years incarceration. The full transcript of that trial is online at the Old Bailey online website. Just search for Berthold, and you'll find that Mr. Berthold presented all sorts of character references from members of the aristocracy who said that he didn't need to steal, he was a man of good character, but despite that, the judge found him guilty, and Henry Berthold died in an Australian prison. Also amongst the collection, we have the Times newspaper, one of 2 copies for the funeral of Admiral Lord Nelson. Nelson died at the Battle of Trafalgar in October 1805. This is the funeral in January the following year, January the 19th, and this is a commemorative edition of the Times showing the designs which were applied to the coffin of Lord Nelson, with an annotated list of what the various symbols represent. It's unusual because for the time newspapers simply weren't illustrated. It took too long, as I said earlier, to prepare a wood engraving that could be used. it was time consuming to produce this sort of printing block. Fortunately, Nelson had been dead for a good 4 months, and that was time enough for the Times to commission an illustration and to print it. So an unusual illustrated front page there. Also, among the newspaper collection, the Illustrated Weekly Budget. It's very fragile, printed on wood pulp. This has been repaired by our conservators more than once. It's not in the best of shape. This was an unusual piece because it claimed to be the world's first penny newspaper to be printed in colours. In fact, it's really just the front and the back page. And the problem with the Weekly Budget is that the time it took to prepare the colour separations and to print it, which I guess was probably done on a flatbed press rather than a rotary newspaper press, meant that it could never carry topical news. The Weekly Budget carried a rehash of the previous week's news. And so I don't think it went beyond one issue. I've not been able to find any record of a second or third issue. People didn't want yesterday's news. And so the Weekly Budget, despite its attractive front page in full colour, didn't survive. The back page, the sports pages, have the distinction of carrying the first picture of Chelsea football team in colour. Of course, it's a black and white photograph which has been tinted or overprinted with the coloured tint, but to find a picture of a football team, any football team, in November 1908 is certainly quite unusual. So that's the Illustrated Weekly Budget's claim to fame, the first picture of Chelsea. One of the other newspapers, I call this the Daily Braille. It's a Braille edition of the Daily Mail, which is still published today. After the First World War, a lot of soldiers who'd been gassed and blinded in the trenches came back to Blighty, and there were various attempts amongst newspapers and magazines to produce Braille editions to support our brave lads who'd come home blinded in their fight for freedom. They didn't survive very long. The Daily Mail actually wasn't printed by the Daily Mail itself. They didn't have the facilities to produce a Braille newspaper. There was a specialist printer in Scotland, the Braille Printing Company in Edinburgh, who published many similar works. But it was expensive, it was subcontracted, and sadly I don't think this lasted very long, certainly no more than a handful of issues. The front page is printed in Braille, but it also has an overprint. Inside it is entirely in Braille, so if you aren't blind, you can't read it. And finally, from this small selection of newspapers, I brought out the Radio Times in colour, something we take for granted today. Of course the Radio Times is in colour. Well, it actually wasn't in colour in I think this is 1961. Yes, August 1961. This is an experimental copy of the Radio Times, printed in colour, to see if it was possible to produce the weekly television and radio listings magazine with colour on every page. And indeed it has colour on virtually every page. Advertising and pictures of, I think that's Jack Lemmon in this particular case. Interestingly, I was talking to somebody at the current publisher of Radio Times, and they do not have a copy of this experimental issue. It's the Radio Times 4-colour experiment. And so I think they're quite anxious to get some scans of this for their archives. It's quite a rarity. I guess it was produced in a very small print run. On newsprint again, so it's quite fragile, but this one has survived in very good condition, and we're very pleased to have that in the newspaper collection at St Bride.